G'day. Well, today we're looking at Luke's Gospel, chapter 4, as we think about the agenda of Jesus. So, reading from chapter 4, verses 14 to 21, we see, "Then Jesus, filled with the power of the Spirit, returned to Galilee, and a report about him spread through the surrounding country. He began to teach in their synagogues and was praised by everybody. When he came to Nazareth, where he'd been brought up, he went to the synagogue on the Sabbath day, as was his custom. He stood up to read, and the scroll of the prophet Isaiah was given to him. He unrolled the scroll and found the place where it was written, 'The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he has anointed me to bring good news to the poor. He sent me to proclaim release to the captives and recovery of sight to the blind, to let the oppressed go free, to proclaim the year of the Lord's favour.' And he rolled up the scroll, gave it back to the attendant, and sat down. The eyes of all in the synagogue were upon him. Then he began to say to them, 'Today this scripture has been fulfilled in your hearing.'" John chapter 9 tells about Jesus' healing of a man who was born blind. Jesus' disciples asked, "Who sinned that this man was born blind, himself or his parents?" Jesus replied, "Neither. This is to demonstrate God's glory." When we consider Jesus' talk in the Nazareth Synagogue, we should keep this story in mind. Jesus proclaimed his kingdom's agenda that day, and it was good news to the poor, release to the captives, recovery of sight to the blind, liberation of the oppressed. And this was because the Jubilee year had come. The first sermon I heard about this passage was when I was nearly 17, and I was new in the church. Our pastor was a good man, but he and I didn't always agree. He said that Jesus promised a home in heaven to the poor in spirit, release from sin's bondage for sinners, spiritual insight for the spiritually blind, and release for all believers from Satan's oppression. Well, it includes all those things, but that's not a sermon's worth. There's far more. I told my pastor that can't be right. Look how people reacted. Telling them about heaven to come won't get them so excited that they ask, "Where did this bloke come from?" Neither will it get them so angry that they want to kill him. Jesus proclaims real here and now change, and they react from one extreme to the other. And while there are some parts of my theology that have changed in the past nearly 60 years, that hasn't changed. Jesus promises a new deal for those who are on New Start. He promises a get out of jail card for prisoners. He promises, you could say, corneal grafts for the blind, the end of oppression, whether we're talking about the invasive Romans or fat capitalist bosses straight from the communist newspapers. Maybe not exactly like that, but the fact that Jesus means a real life revolution for the outcast and struggling is very clear. So what did Jesus do? We heard what he preached, but what did he do to actually begin that process? He didn't get government grants for the poor, but he did do something important. He valued the poor and the outcast. So when you read about him partying with tax collectors and sinners, some of them will be wealthy, some will be poor. But he makes it clear over and over that he values them. We see how people loved him, like the woman who breaks open the sealed jar of perfume and washes his feet. He encouraged them to be generous with one another. When he said, "Don't lay up treasures for yourself where moth and rust corrupt," he was saying, if you have something, do good with it now. But more importantly, as we know, the shin bone's connected to the knee bone. So change in one thing affects change in another. When Jesus made the blind to see and the lame to walk, it wasn't so they could go home and watch telly or go hiking through the Cotswolds. It gave a man back his work. The beggar could stand up, look around, and labour in a paddock to earn his own keep. When Jesus delivered someone, who needs to know whether it was a demon or a manic episode? It's enough that he released that person to function in society. It was good news for the poor because it worked. Mutual support, improved resources, upward mobility, they all go together. Apart from Barabbas, I can't remember anyone Jesus literally got out of jail. We could talk about when he sent an angel to get Peter out, or an earthquake to release Paul and Silas. But again, do you remember the parable of the two debtors? Surely you remember that one owed an enormous amount to the king, but he begged for mercy and the king let him off. But then the same man met someone who owed him money and had no mercy at all. And when the king heard of it, he threw the first man into the debtor's prison and told him he was definitely not coming out until he'd paid every last dollar. We get the principles okay, but we often miss the detail, and that is that a person in debt could be thrown into prison and made to stay until he'd paid off all that he owed. Even in the 19th century, you can still be imprisoned for debt. When Jesus enabled people to earn, he rescued them from the threat of prison. When he made them capable of sustained employment, he made them less likely to steal. When he encouraged them to support each other, to be generous rather than self-protective, then he helped them to keep their freedom. So what did Jesus' disciples do? You've read in Acts how Ananias healed Paul's blindness. You read how Paul and Silas were sprung from prison in Philippi. You read about Paul freeing the demonized girl who was following him around and shouting. But let's move on in history a bit. When I had my tonsils out, I had an asthma attack and ruptured the wounds in my throat. Instead of going home that day, I had to stay until they stopped the bleeding and then stay another day to ensure I was okay. One of the things they did was that they reached down my throat with tongs and swabs soaked in sweet-smelling friar's balsam. It was sort of like liquid Band-Aids. That was called friar's balsam because the medieval monks or friars carried a bottle in their kit. They took Jesus seriously. If he sent disciples to heal the sick, they had to take a medical kit with them. Friar's balsam, oil, wine, bandages, probably a knife to get splinters out. Jesus never said you can only heal the sick if you do it by a prayer miracle. I have seen healings after prayer, but I've also seen where a Christian turned up in a crisis, applied first aid, and also brought faith and hope to that injured or troubled person. In Roman times, if you were poor and you were sick or injured, no rich person would pick you up and look after you. That was your business. You were probably a bad character who deserved what you got. Not much different from the disciples, really, was it, who asked if the blind man deserved his blindness. But Christians picked up the poor, the sick and the injured and cared for them. The anti-Christian writer Celsus, among other things, complained that Christians undermined the social order, while the Emperor Julian told the pagan priests that they'd better look after the poor and sick as well as the Christians did, or they would be swamped by the Christian tide. Christians don't care, or didn't care, if you were rich or poor, an ex-prisoner or a moral philosopher. Care is for all. Nicholas of Myra was said to have paid for the dowries of poor girls to keep them from prostitution and enable them to marry. Much more recently, the charity Christian Solidarity International was buying enslaved women and children back from the North Sudanese That was so between 1995 and 2000, they redeemed about 6,000 people. Slavery is another kind of bondage. Jesus didn't promise miracles every time, but he did say that he had good news for the poor and release for the captives, recovery of sight for the blind, liberation for the oppressed. And throughout history, some Christians have lived up to that goal. They've sought to achieve those conditions in the world. Of course, many Christians have lived up to it. Many Christians have resisted what Jesus preached. The road is broad and leads to destruction, and many find it. The point is that, as they say, if you give a man a fish, he eats for a day, but if you teach him to fish, he feeds his family for the rest of his life. What they don't tell you is that if you give a man a fish every day, he eats until you die. But if you create a fish donation society, it can go on donating fish through all eternity. Jesus created a fish donation society, not literally, but a society for doing good until he returns. And this brings us to you and me. What are we doing? If Jesus expressed his kingdom agenda in terms of good news for the poor, release for captives, recovery of sight for the blind, liberation for the oppressed, that sums up his idea of love for our neighbour. We don't put it in those terms, but if we tell someone to pull himself out of poverty, reform himself, make a new start away from a life of crime, we are as irresponsibly complicit in their oppression as were those who said that the blind man must have been a sinner and the child of sinners to be born that way. Australia's level of support for the unemployed is criminally low. It forces people into poverty under the assumption that the pain of poverty will drive them to find a job. It doesn't address the availability and distribution of jobs. It blames the victim who doesn't have a job. Australia's imprisonment of asylum seekers is nothing less than holding hostages in concentration camps. What am I doing to set them free? What good news do we bring to those held under the conditions that Novak Djokovic found intolerable even for a few days? They've survived 7-8 years. Notice that I didn't say that they're held in extermination camps, but they are in what very definitely fits every definition of concentration camps. Why aren't they being liberated? This cruelty has gone on too long, and both sides are complicit. I'm sure there's some area in our own country where eyesight is literally under threat and neglected. Certainly in Central Australia, cataracts and eye diseases are rampant because of climate and hygiene issues. You know about Fred Hollows, you know about the Christian Blind Mission, you know about many other mission groups which do what they can. There are people doing what they can. And now you know that Fred Hollows was an atheist, but he was every bit as much following the principles of Jesus, bringing recovery of sight to the blind. Whether Jesus' followers follow him or not, his purposes will not be thwarted. He's the Lord, and it's our choice whether we yield to him or go our own way toward destruction. And what about oppression? Have you heard of black deaths in custody? Have you heard that some children's facilities in Australia, even in our cities, are vastly below standard with what amounts to torture going on? Jesus said in Matthew 16, if anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, but whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? In the 17th, 18th and 19th centuries, first the Quakers, then Methodists, and finally Anglicans and Utilitarians struggled to condemn slavery in the English colonies. It was blatant oppression and had to end. But those who heard the words of Jesus calling them to follow him didn't give in because it was a long haul, or because the opposition was difficult to bear, or because of the toll it took. They knew he'd called them to free the oppressed and liberate the captives, and he still calls us to do it today. So let's do it. Amen. Thank you for watching this morning, and please like and subscribe using the link down the bottom there.